Shall we begin? Let's begin now.
Hello everyone, welcome to my channel. I am the Pinkcrusader. Today we're going to be talking about an article on spinal cord injury, British Columbia. SCIBC. It's kind of an alphabet. The article is titled, "If I Knew Then, 8 years after my injury, I finally understand what it means to be okay." It's kind of an awkward title. I think they should drop the "if I knew then." But anyway, this is an article about a young woman named Jessica Kruger, and she talks about some of the realizations she had over time after living with spinal cord injury. Now, I found this article very poignant and kind of mirrors some of my own experiences. She got injured at 15, I got injured at 16, so very similar age range that we had our onset of our spinal cord injury. And yeah, well, I think it's a very important article for people who are new to have an acute onset SEI or any other kind of impairment, be that disease, virus, injury, what have you. I think it's an important thing that they could really learn early on. They'll have much better lives. So let's talk about it. At first, she starts off talking about her understanding of what it means that when you hear that you're never going to walk again. Oftentimes, when we first hear that, there's a bit of denial, and some people hear it as a bit of a challenge, especially for the people much like Jessica who have an incomplete injury where part of her body that just isn't functioning correctly still wiggles and moves, kind of like what I can do with my fingers. She could wiggle her a toe or two, and she's like, well, if I can do that, I'll just keep working at it and I'll be fine. And I went through similar things. There's a bit of a denial that sets in at first. I remember being in the hospital for the first 3 weeks and thinking, well, I'm going to be out of here in a couple of weeks. It'll be fine. Everything will go back to normal. Well, it doesn't. So yeah, and I think part of the reason, this isn't in this article, but I think part of the reason for the way people do that is because in a lot of ways, what you're experiencing is the grief of the grief of loss, much like a death in the family, because somebody did die. The person that died was who you were, who you wanted to be. The person that had all your hopes and dreams, that person died. The person who had, I don't know, it's just the person you thought you were going to be no longer exists. That person is dead, and they're not coming back. And so you really have to rediscover who you want to be, and it's always harder to find a new dream than to go after one. So, yeah, so I think that's where a lot of that comes from. But yeah, I completely agree. At first, you kind of think, well, I'll be fine. Everything's going to be okay. And there's just a lot of denial. So she says, but the realities conflicted with the idealizations, and the one toe didn't lead to all 10 of them following suit as I intended it to. After I realized that I wasn't going to be okay in my own interpretation, I focused on being okay in everyone else's definition. I worked on getting stronger to satisfy my physical therapist, did hand exercises to reassure my occupational therapist, put a smile on to convince my family, cracked jokes to distract my friends. Maybe if I could persuade everyone else that this wasn't really happening, then I wouldn't have to acknowledge that it was. And maybe she was thinking that way. I don't necessarily know that putting on a strong face for other people is denying that it happened. I think it's more denying that it's affecting you as much as it is. Um, and I think people do that. And I think we continue to do it throughout our life because dealing with an SCI, especially a quad, someone who's got paralysis on all of their limbs, there comes with a whole bunch of health problems and health issues that I don't think most people realize, and you can't always see them. And everything just becomes harder, just pretty much everything. And so we often feel exhaustion in the ways that most people don't. And in order to have a life, you kind of have to just push through it. And if you're the person that's constantly got the tired face and is, you know, not saying yes to doing things and just constantly a hermit and all these things, you're the person that's hard to be around, and you don't want to be that person. And I don't think it's healthy to be that person. So I think it's perfectly fine to put on a brave face, and I think it helps. And I don't necessarily know that it's denying what's happened to you, but it's certainly denying that you're letting it get to you, which can be a problem in its own right. And I think that's more or less what she's getting at. So, but she also goes on here to say, I thought it had worked. Over time, I forgot that I had been acting and began to believe that I was living. I returned back to high school, got involved in wheelchair sports, volunteered, got a boyfriend, spent time with friends and family, and everything seemed normal. And here's the thing, if she was actually doing all those things, life was pretty normal. It was a way for her to get back into and create a new normal. She had a whole bunch of differences. Obviously, all those things that she was doing wasn't exactly the same as she was doing before, but she was doing them. And the thing is she was doing all the right things. If you're doing all those things and getting back out there, doesn't mean that uh, in the first few years you're not going to have issues. She goes on to talk about her having a collapsed lung from pneumonia and having uh, bad bouts of bladder infections that made her body resistant, that became resistant to oral antibiotics. So when she does get bladder infections nowadays, and even back then, um, she needed IV antibiotics, which happens quite a lot to people who get a lot of infections. And a urogenic bladder is really prone to infections. Um, um, but learning how to deal with all those things and having those things truly affect your psyche in a really, really difficult way is not unusual. And it doesn't mean that all the things that you're doing to try to have a happy life in the interim of getting used to it are things that are basically denying reality, because they are your reality still. So I don't necessarily know that I agree with that these things were somehow fake in any way. Can you fake having a boyfriend? Sure, but if she actually had one, was she faking it? No, she had a boyfriend. And she probably had a pretty good high school relationship, I would imagine. She looks in her pictures like she's fairly happy, and she probably was. But that doesn't mean that you're going to go through bouts where you're not happy. You're going to go through very difficult times in the early years, and sometimes even later on. This is just one of those things that's hard, and everybody goes through ups and downs. It's just when you have so much to deal with, sometimes those ups and downs can be cliffs and just almost feel insurmountable. So I think it's just a slight difference that I would say. So let's get down to. So here's a more important part of the article. Somewhere during that string of infections, I hit my rock bottom. I found myself in a place of self-pity, anger, frustration, and confusion. I asked myself the question that had been lingering just beneath the surface for nearly 3 years. Why me? There was no answer, and that was okay, because it was the question that allowed the realization that led to the healing. I didn't want to pretend to be happy anymore. I wanted to genuinely feel happy, and I wasn't sure how to do that. Slowly with time, I began to acknowledge that I was likely never going to walk again. Rather than devoting my energy to pretending I wasn't really in a wheelchair, I began to accept that I was. Now here's the thing. What what I want people to understand from this is that when you first get injured, chances are you're going to devote an overwhelming amount of your time and energy and uh, mental strength and emotions into trying to cure yourself of the ailment that you have, whether it's an SCI, an acute onset impairment from a virus, disease, whatever it is. Most of these things often come with the result that you're not ever going to get there. You may never walk again. It's likely you won't. And I think it's important for people to accept that more early on. It's not a good thing to shut down and and not worry about your health entirely, because your health is going to become somewhat of a focal point for your life. I have to take care of a lot of things that of ways in myself and do a lot of things that people who don't have an SEI uh, will never have to do. And I have to do them just to stay alive. And that's okay. You learn to cope with those things. But the day that you give up on needing to get better and are able to take all that energy that was going into something that was completely hopeless for the most part and focus it into portions of your life that can actually make for a good life, the things that even if you are an ambulatory person, if you don't focus on, you have a terrible life. If you don't focus them, if you don't focus on them when you do have an impairment and a disability, you're going to have a terrible life. The minute you start focusing on those things, your life starts to improve. And if you spend just a ridiculous amount of time, and years even, not focusing on those, you're setting yourself back. Once you have an impairment and a disability, it's an uphill struggle to begin with. You tack on a few years of not working on that stuff, it's now a cliff you have to climb. So for anyone who's dealing with an onset disability or dealing with a loved one, a friend, a family member, a significant other, a child, going through this, I really hope that you learn from her mistakes and you learn from mine. Don't focus so much on getting completely better. Sure, focus on getting healthier, healthier. Focus on learning how to live with your health. And if you see improvements, go ahead and focus on those improvements and seeing how much you can get back. But absolutely do not neglect the things that actually make life worth living. She finishes here saying that I wish I knew what being in a wheelchair really meant. I wish that I could have understood the perks. Not the prime parking spots or the cushy bathrooms or short lines, but the friendships, the community, and the satisfaction and pride that comes years later in a moment of reflection. This life, with all of its highs and lows, is the one that was meant for me, and I am grateful to be able to live it. I don't know that there is any sort of life that is meant for anyone, per se, but certainly the friendships and community and all the things that make life life, the 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 hobbies, the jobs, the people, the relationships, the activities, all the things that you do that if you did not do as a person who didn't have a disability, you wouldn't have a life. Man, if you do not have those in your life, disabled or otherwise, you don't have one. You just don't have a life. So if you take anything away from people who have lived enough time with these things. It's that. Focus on those things. And if you don't want to focus on getting better, don't. It's not the most important thing in your life. Your life can be good without it. Certainly try to be healthy. Everyone has to try to be healthy. But mostly focus on being happy. You won't regret it. I'm the Pinkcrusader. Thank you all for watching. Take care.